Hello, everybody. I am here to talk to you about Chapter 13, Violence, Victims, and Criminal Justice. So let's get started on that. All right. So we are almost done, but this is a very important chapter because it covers a lot of different things that social workers can run into and will run into in their careers, at least peripherally. Okay, so some basic statistics. Um, there's about, I think, 330 million people in the United States, something like that. And 2 million of them are incarcerated, which turns out to be a much higher rate than any other country. And the closest one behind us, I think, is Saudi Arabia. I'm not really sure. I could easily Google that, but I didn't. um, but most countries are a lot further behind than that. So we have kind of a lot going on in this realm. Over 7 million people, so that includes that 2 million people plus 5 million more, are parolees or probationers. So parolees were at one time incarcerated, probationers were not. Okay, so there's kind of two schools of thought on criminal behavior. One is that criminal behavior is all about the individual, and what they're what they're doing is completely internal to them and has nothing to do with any of the context around us. And then there are sociological theories that you are sort of a product of your environment, and yes, you have free will and all of that, but there's a lot more to it than just like one day waking up and deciding to do something criminal. There are a lot of factors that come in on multiple levels that influence those choices and behaviors. And I think you probably know by now which side of this argument we as social workers fall on. It's not that there are no individual factors, of course, it's that context matters, right? So you've seen this before in that context. We really feel strongly that there are lots of different ways that we are impacted by the systems around us. It's not just about us. So you will remember Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, and this comes up again, right? So we have to work really hard to not only see how we're being impacted by all the different levels, but also kind of work to dismantle the dysfunctional parts of that. So that's how I like to think about criminality, is always in the context. So basically, you know, we as social workers have kind of a set of values around violence and criminal behavior and all of that. And that doesn't mean that every situation is the same and that we should be treating everybody the same and that it's nobody's fault. And it's much more complex than that. There's lots of space to have empathy and to kind of look at the larger picture while also, holding people responsible for their own decisions and own actions. And that's tricky. It's really tricky. But we have to be able to do that balance because yes, all those levels of systems matter, but also we, the individual, are level on that system. So we matter too, right? Our decisions that we make matter also. So when we talk about how poverty and and violence and violent behavior and criminal behavior. Not all violent behavior is criminal. Not all criminal behavior is violent. When we talk about all of that stuff, we need to talk about how poverty and all of that walk hand in hand, and why they're so intertwined. And that's not an easy answer, but there are lots and lots and lots of reasons why they work together, why people who are living in poverty tend to have higher levels of criminality, tend to have higher levels of violence, and you know are more involved in the criminal justice system. It's you can't really pick apart these two things. So um, you know, making sure that our prisons are places where um, you can learn skills that you need to kind of improve your circumstances on the outside is kind of an ideal world situation. Is that happening? In some places it is. In some places it isn't. So if you're familiar with the podcast Ear Hustle, Ear Hustle is a wonderful podcast that they had a few years of. It was a joint venture between NPR and one of the inmates in San Quentin, and it sort of explored the lots of different aspects of incarceration at San Quentin. And San Quentin is one of the more progressive prisons. Has a lot of cool programs, does a lot to try to get people, growing and changing and improving themselves so that when they're released, they can make different choices and kind of go down different paths. So that's pretty unusual. Most prisons are not so forward thinking. But it's also a matter of the philosophy of the people who manage the prison system, is whether their philosophy is one of rehabilitation, which is what we're talking about here on this slide, versus punishment, right? Which is basically just like, lock them up, throw away the key, don't worry about rehabilitation. They can't be rehabilitated. Just like punish, 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 and hopefully that will work. Does that work? Research says no. Rehabilitation does work. But again, this is one of those situations where politics is really very important to consider, because politicians control the purse strings on prisons, and what programs are available or what philosophy is being employed in the prison has a lot to do with politics. Okay, so with regards to individual offenders, what where it kind of gets a little bit sticky, right, is when we're talking about violent career criminals, right? So your serial rapists, for example, your sociopaths, your folks who really aren't aren't going to change, right? When that even comes out of my mouth, it doesn't sound quite right, right? Because the overarching theme of social work is that we believe that people can change, right? We believe that there are things that we can do that impact our paths in this world, and that we're capable of growing and changing and improving. So when you get into the criminal justice side of things, and you have to kind of face the fact that there are people out there who shouldn't be trusted to that whatever change that they've made should not be trusted anyway, right? And there are lots and lots of examples of this, but this is probably the stickiest topic around criminal justice work and social work, is this particular issue of who can be rehabilitated, who can't be rehabilitated, and we just need to lock them up and like what, forget about them. I have a real hard time with that concept, right? Personally, as a worker, but um, I understand it. I understand it, but it's a struggle for me. So I don't expect it to be cut and dry for you either. Whatever side of that you fall onto, whether you're more like, no, I feel like everybody can be rehabilitated. There's nobody that's lost. Or you think like, well, once a murderer, or once a rapist, always a murderer, always a rapist, right? It's sticky. right? And you need to think about how you feel about all that. So, you know, I talked about this just a little bit, but like, you know, our our focus um, as social workers is on the strengths perspective, right? And that's very much at odds with most of the criminal justice system, right? That sees pretty much everything as about control and punishment, and it's not all about that, of course. But like, we just had a whole conversation about like how we do things a little bit differently at San Quentin, and how that's also not common. So it's kind of our job as social workers to move the system along, to do whatever we can to do social change, to move the system along to change. Um, right now, the trend is to simply build more prisons and privatize them, which is a whole different set of problems, and to try juveniles as adults. So this is a slightly clearer issue. Juveniles, their brains are not fully formed. Period. They're not, and it's difficult for me to come to the conclusion that juveniles should be treated the same way as adults are treated, because their brains aren't done developing yet. Like we can help them in theory. So again, this is not my field. Um, in criminal justice, it's something every social worker touches. I've touched it for sure, but it's not my focus. And for me, the trend towards trying juveniles as adults is really disturbing. Okay, so I talk about this quite a bit in my lecture about racial disparities that you should have seen in whatever chapter that was about child welfare. I don't remember what number it was, but the child welfare chapter, there was a whole lecture about this. And if you don't remember what I'm talking about, you should definitely go back and watch it. But the point is that there's a lot of systemic oppression in the system, and it sort of is self-perpetuating with regards to the criminal justice system. So I talk about this as well in that lecture. In the beginning of that lecture, I talk about this. Women have present different issues in the prison system for a lot of different reasons, but one that's very important to us as social workers is the idea that women are usually the caretakers, and sometimes often the only caretaker for children. And the minute they're arrested, there's nobody available to care for their children. So there's a lot of kids that end up displaced because of kind of what we were talking about on the previous slide about the systemic oppression and the problems that go along with that. So I really would encourage you to go back to at least the first 5 or 10 minutes of that lecture and take a look at that, because I do talk about how this works, and what it might look like. Okay. So some other groups that you might want to consider, especially inmates with disabilities, health problems, that includes mental health problems, and undocumented immigrants, all very specialized issues, and interesting areas for exploration, say for future papers or for your field placement, if you're going to do a field placement, that sort of thing. Okay, so practice settings. I added truancy court here to juvenile and family courts. In some places, truancy is not part of this system, but in California it is. It also, in California, it also includes like I don't know how else to put it, like divorce court. Family court is essentially about divorces, right, and custody and that sort of thing. So and that's the big umbrella here. But what they're talking about is mainly child welfare and juvenile justice, right? So juvenile justice and child welfare work very closely together, but they're different courts, and they have different rules and different laws and different things that they're dealing with. And child welfare is about parents and having parents do changes so that they can get their kids back. Um, but juvenile justice is about the juvenile and getting the juvenile sorted out so that they can, return to school, not be imprisoned anymore, whatever it is, right? So that's kind of the basic differences between those two courts. Truancy court is literally about going to school. Yes, that's a legal issue, and there is an actual court for that. So, okay. So juvenile corrections. In juvenile corrections, mainly it's very boot camp kind of style, like exactly what you're picturing from the movies about those types of like reform school type situations. There's a lot of that. Many jobs that you can get, even at the level that you're at now. So even if you just have your associates, you can get jobs in these settings. Adult corrections, it's a little bit more. Social workers in this setting tend to be at the master's level, and what you're doing there is kind of more case management, mental health, that kind of stuff. It's they're very different settings. Let's put it that way, because adult corrections is literally prison or jail. Community corrections. So what we're talking about here is like the community programs that are not in the prison or the jail. A lot of these jobs out there, and again, a lot of them are not. You don't need more than what you have right now. And if you have a criminal record, but you've shown that you have kind of done a bunch of work to move past it, they want you. That you are the person they are looking to employ. Okay, so victim assistance. This is a little different. So picture working for the prosecutor's office. That's what victim assistance social workers do. They advocate for victims, and there are a lot of federal programs for this. There are programs that address specifically children as victims. There are specific programs for everybody. So it's a very big field, and the federal money, there's good federal money behind victim assistance. Juvenile offenders. So these are some important questions around juvenile offenders. I feel like the answer to the second question is very clear. Sometimes prison can be a bit of a training ground for offenders who are not high-level offenders, but then they go to prison and they become high-level offenders because they're surrounded by high-level offenders who kind of teach them what they need to know. So I think we need to be really careful. I mean, aside from the fact that as juvenile, they are vulnerable, right? And we're not talking here about mixing the populations necessarily. We're talking about having them be in the same types of facilities, right? But you'd be surprised how much information gets passed back and forth regardless, right? So the other question is less clear, and the way that our system is set up is that sometimes yes, sometimes no. They get tried as adults sometimes and sometimes not, but it does tend to be moving more towards try the juveniles as adults, which I think is going the wrong direction completely. Okay, so back to crime and mental illness. Think about this: 20% of inmates in jail or prison are in need of psychiatric care. 20%. Oh my God, 1 out of 5, right? So and look at that number for juvenile offenders, right? So like This is very, you cannot do criminal justice social work without being very well versed in mental health. I feel like we kind of touched on this a little bit, but basically, victims have a whole bunch of rights that they you might not be familiar with. So here they are. Okay. I talked about privatization a little bit. That's a little too much for what we're doing today. But domestic violence, there's a lot going on in this field about how to kind of reform folks who are perpetrators, but also how to help survivors of domestic violence. The death penalty is an evolving issue as well. Around abolition is really the question: is should there be a death penalty? I don't have an answer for that. Okay, so that is your lecture for this week. Please come to office hours if you have any questions. We're getting towards the end of the semester, so make sure that you ask any questions that you have. Thank you. Bye-bye.